The Subcommittee on Domestic Policy of the Committee on Oversight and Government Reform will now come to order. The hearing will evaluate international supply reduction programs intended to stop the flow of illicit drugs into the United States. We'll be joined shortly by some of my other colleagues here, and I appreciate the cooperation of the minority staff in permitting us to proceed. Without objection, the Chair and Ranking Minority Member will have 5 minutes to make opening statements, followed by opening statements not to exceed 3 minutes by any other member who seeks recognition. And without objection, members and witnesses may have 5 legislative days to submit a written statement or extraneous materials for the record. Today, I want to welcome all of you who are here today and to let you know that I appreciate you taking the time to join us for this important discussion about the issue of supply reduction. The subcommittee continues its oversight of the Office of National Drug Control Policy by focusing on U.S. international counter-narcotics policies and programs. Over the last decade, international supply reduction efforts in source countries and transit zones have accounted for almost 40% of the federal spending on drug policy. Funding levels for international counter-narcotics were not always so high. Under the Bush administration, federal resources for supply reduction increased by over 60%. Interdiction spending alone increased over 100%. But despite acknowledgement from the current administration that international supply-side programs like crop eradication and interdiction have not been effective in reducing the availability of drugs in the United States, and the treatment and prevention are far more cost-effective, those programs are still being funded at significant levels. The President's drug control budget request for fiscal 2011 asks for $15.5 billion, of which $6 billion is slated for international support and interdiction. This hearing will scrutinize those spending decisions and evaluate what we've accomplished in this decade through supply reduction programs, both in terms of the national drug policy goal of reducing consumption in the U.S. and other foreign policy objectives. We'll hear from the Government Accountability Office, which will tell us that for all the money we spend on international counter-narcotics programs, there's been limited success in reducing the flow of drugs to the U.S., and we've done a poor job of ensuring that there are high-quality criteria to measure how useful and cost-effective these programs really are. This is consistent with what many drug policy experts have been saying for years. The evidence, after all, is stark. After spending billions of dollars on aerial crop spraying programs and efforts to interdict drugs, drug supply and consumption in the United States remain strong. The question we hope today's hearing will answer is, if international programs like eradication or interdiction simply cannot make much of a difference in U.S. drug consumption, then to what extent should we be continuing these costly programs? We cannot and we do not ignore legitimate national security concerns, and we must face squarely connections between the illicit drug trade and insurgents or terrorists. But such international policies and goals should not be confused with drug control policy in the United States. If the goals of these programs are, in fact, now justified on grounds of national security and helping stabilize democracy and rule of law abroad, then we need to evaluate whether and how U.S. counter-narcotics policy and dollars should play a role in those programs, if at all, and what role the White House Office of National Drug Control Policy should play as the leader in federal drug control policy. Our witnesses today will applaud some shifts we are seeing in international counter-narcotics efforts under this administration, de-emphasizing military and police aid and focusing more on strengthening civilian governance, justice, and economic opportunity. For the first time, the U.S. government is starting to consider anti-poverty programs and justice reform as part of its counter-narcotics efforts, recognizing that marginalized populations must have sufficient legal alternative livelihoods if we can hope that they will cease illegal crop cultivation and trafficking. But they will also caution that U.S. counter-narcotics programs are in danger of repeating the same mistakes we've made in the past and must undertake an honest assessment of the unintended negative consequences of these policies. For example, Mexico's efforts to crack down on drug trafficking is one factor generating a wave of horrifying killings. Our efforts in Afghanistan may be contributing to the insurgency by enriching the Taliban. Our work in Colombia, while successful in improving security, came with significant costs. Aerial spraying has grievously harmed the environment and punished impoverished farmers who have no other way to feed themselves. And the U.S. support of Colombian military's fight against guerrillas effectively underwrote extensive human rights violations that have gone unpunished. Those unintended consequences will be discussed at today's hearing as part of an effort to evaluate these counter-narcotics programs holistically. Again, I want to thank each and every one of you for your attendance, thank the witnesses for their appearance here today. And now it's my privilege to recognize the ranking member of the committee and my partner in so many of these important hearings, Mr. Jordan Oklahoma.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I apologize for running a few minutes late. We were actually downstairs near the room. Thank you, Chairman Kucinich, for holding this important hearing today. Our nation continues to face a drug problem that takes lives, brings about violence, and tears apart communities and families. We need to take every opportunity, make every effort to eliminate this problem with an approach that focuses both on keeping drugs from entering the country and curbing addiction here at home. In the last decade, the United States spent over $20 billion to fight the war on drugs domestically and internationally. Winning the war on drugs is vital to the health and safety of Americans at home, and it is important to our national security. The threats surrounding the international drug trade, from the Taliban in Afghanistan to the violent cartels in Mexico, is real and has serious foreign policy implications. I'm pleased to see that ONDCP budget requests for 2011 increases both the international and interdiction components of the drug control budget. Support for the U.S. government's international eradication and interdiction efforts is an important part of the supply reduction strategy. Through eradication, interdiction, enforcement, and basic government support, we have seen some success, but we need to be certain that our international drug policies translate into reduced supply and ultimately reduce demand here at home. We know that drug trafficking has provided a means of funding terrorist and insurgent groups, some of which we are fighting abroad. However, there is some debate over how best to curtail these activities. I look forward to hearing from the witnesses today about which programs are working, which ones aren't, and how we can do the most good with the limited resources we have. Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back before this microphone drives everyone crazy there.
Thank the gentleman for his presence here. As the days wind down in the House, there are many different things going on simultaneously, including markups. So I may need to briefly recess this hearing to run to a markup downstairs, which only for the purpose of voting. So I just want to kind of give everyone a heads up about that. I want to introduce our first panelist, Mr. Jess Ford is currently Director of International Affairs and Trade for the Government Accountability Office, the GAO. He joined GAO in 1973 and has worked extensively on national security and international affairs activities. He's managed GAO audits of the U.S. Agency for International Development, the State Department, DHS, and Department of Defense and other federal agencies. Mr. Ford, I want to thank you for appearing before our subcommittee. Now, one other thing about today, we're not supplied with a clock here. So that means your testimony will be timeless. But still 5 minutes. So if staff would kind of give me the heads up when it's 5, and I'll just wave or say something to indicate that it'd be good to wrap it up. But as you know, your entire statement will be included in the record, and it's much appreciated that you're here. Mr. Ford, I'd like you to know that it's customary for all witnesses who appear before the Committee on Oversight and Government Reform to be sworn in. before they testified. I'd ask that you would stand. Please raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear that the testimony which you are about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Thank you, sir. Let the record reflect that the witness answered in the affirmative. You may proceed, Mr. Ford. Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, members of the subcommittee, I'm pleased to be here today to discuss GAO's body of work on international and interdiction counter-narcotics activities. Over the last decade, we've issued over 20 reports covering a wide array of program activity in countries such as Colombia, Afghanistan, the Transit Zone, Mexico, Venezuela, and other key countries that are involved in international drug trafficking. Today I'm going to talk about 4 topics that I'd like to mention to the subcommittee. First, having to do with the issues related to the reported results of some of our programs. Secondly, I'm going to talk about factors that relate to our ability to judge the effectiveness of our programs. Third, I want to talk a little bit about the nexus between our counter-narcotics goals and our other foreign policy objectives. And fourthly, I'm going to discuss the difficulties in trying to measure the effectiveness of these programs. A key goal of the U.S. National Drug Control Strategy is to reduce illicit drug use in the United States. These programs are designed primarily in source countries such as Colombia and Afghanistan, as well as in transit countries such as Mexico, the Central America, and the Caribbean. They've included interdiction of maritime drug shipments on the high seas, support for foreign military and civilian institutions engaged in drug eradication, detection, and also the rule of law and alternative development programs, all of which are designed to affect the supply of drugs that are coming to the United States. GAO's work on these programs, I want to first talk about the first topic, which is really what the results have been reported. We have found that in Afghanistan, Colombia, and in the drug transit zones, the United States and its partner nations have only partially met targets that have been established to reduce drug supply. For example, we recently reported in Afghanistan that opium poppy eradication efforts consistently fell between targets established by the administration. While some Afghan provinces are now poppy-free, U.S. and Afghan opium poppy eradication strategy did not achieve its original goals of reducing the level of poppy in the country. In 2008, we reported that after 6 years, Plan Colombia had met some of its key goals in reducing poppy cultivation, but it had not achieved its goal for reducing coca crops. Most recently, the administration has reported additional reductions in the amount of potential cocaine that can be produced in Colombia, which suggests that the program has in fact achieved some of the original goals intended, although for a longer period of time than was originally established. We note that our interdiction goals to stop the flow of drugs, primarily through the transit area, we have not achieved any of those goals since 2007. My second point has to do with the factors that influence program effectiveness, and I'm going to just briefly touch on some of these. I think in the Q&A I can get into this in a little more detail. But the key issues that we find in our work that affect our ability to reduce the supply of illegal drugs, first and foremost, is the level of commitment and cooperation by our partners in influencing the effectiveness of these programs. In Colombia, we reported that over the years, the degree of political commitment and commitment on the part of the Colombian government was a major factor in our ability to reduce supplies in that country and to achieve some of the broader foreign policy goals, which I'll talk about later. Conversely, in other countries where we've had less levels of cooperation, such as in Venezuela, we're unable to effectively achieve some of our interdiction goals because the government there has not been cooperative with the U.S. government since 2005. Another factor that we frequently identified in our work has to do with the level of sustainment that our programs have had, particularly in places in the transit zone and in Central America, where we've provided resources intended to enhance the capacity of those countries to interdict drugs, but the programs themselves, due to lack of sustainment, have not achieved their intended objectives. The third area that I'd like to comment on has to do with the nexus between our counter-narcotics programs and other foreign policy objectives. Currently, in places such as Colombia and Afghanistan, much of our programs there, our counter-narcotics programs, are part of our broader foreign policy objectives to deal with, in the case of Afghanistan, our counterinsurgency problem, and in the case of Colombia, to deal with the problems of security with the FARC and other illegal groups there. And that in trying, and I'm going to get to this in a minute, but in trying to assess effectiveness, we find that this overlap between counter-narcotics and foreign policy goals is problematic in trying to assess the overall effectiveness. Okay, finally, the last point I would like to make has to do with the difficulties in trying to measure the overall effectiveness of these programs. We have found in many of our reports that U.S. agencies lack reliable performance measurement and results information to really judge whether or not we are having a major impact in reducing the supplies and flow of drugs to the United States. An example, in Afghanistan, we found that opium eradication measures were not sufficient for assessing overall U.S. efforts. We also reported that the State Department in the transit area was not able to measure more than half of their programs intended to reduce the flow of drugs. And this morning we are issuing a new report on the Department of Defense efforts to enhance their performance system, and our findings are that the DoD still has not got an effective performance measurement system that enables one to determine whether or not their programs are achieving their intended results. I'm not going to get into all the recommendations we made. I can just say that for the 20 products that I mentioned, we had several recommendations designed to address many of these shortcomings. And in most cases, the administration, the agencies that we dealt with, agreed with our recommendations, and they have taken action. With that, I think I'm going to close, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ford. You know, I'm looking at the report, and just like to piece together some of the comments that the statements that are in this report. You talk about factors that limit program effectiveness, including external factors in partner nations that relate to corruption or lack of political support. Then the report goes on to talk about a lack of political will on the part of Afghan central and provincial governments. And then you also, in a section on limited cooperation between the United States and partner nations, talk about the objections of Afghan officials to certain eradication efforts, and them being slow to grant permission to eradicate poppy fields. Let's talk to this subcommittee a moment about the effect of corruption in Afghan central government and the impediment that presents for the eradication of drugs in Afghanistan, or the eradication of these drug crops in Afghanistan.
Yeah, I mean, our report issued in March, we discussed the problems that our program implementers have had in trying to get cooperation with elements of the Afghan government. And the program at that time was being administered at the provincial level, where the governors of various provinces were our partners, and our ability to get them to support our eradication efforts varied from one place to another. And in some cases, they were unwilling to partner with us and take the actions that were necessary to help achieve the eradication goals. That's one of the key reasons why we didn't achieve those goals. We also developed a...
Is it also one of the reasons why production seems to go up?
Well, certainly, if we're not able to eliminate the crop, I mean, if the crop's
I mean,
not gonna-
production's
not
gone up.
eliminated, then obviously
Production's
production will
gone
go up.
substantially.
The level of production in Afghanistan, I don't have the exact numbers I can supply for the record, but my understanding is that they've gone up in some provinces they've gone up, in other provinces the level of poppy cultivation has actually gone down. So it varies what part of the country you're in, but all in southern part of Afghanistan is where most of the poppy is currently being cultivated. That's the main problem area that we're trying to address.
And how much of an increase has there been there?
Again, I don't have the numbers here in front of me, but I can supply them for the record.
Well, your report states that since 2006, cocaine removal rates from interdiction have declined and have not reached any of the annual targets to date. It also states that long-term gains in crop eradication are difficult because of countermeasures and shifts in production. Yet we spend billions of dollars a year on expensive interdiction and crop eradication efforts. Is there currently any data that would allow for a cost-effective analysis of supply reduction programs like crop eradication or interdiction and reducing supply of illicit drugs,
Okay, let me just clarify. Are you asking just about Afghanistan or in general?
generally?
Okay. We have not, I have not seen any cost-effectiveness analysis directly related to your question, related to either supply reduction or interdiction in terms of how it affects consumption in the United States. The Office of National Drug Control Policy has reports lots of different data on levels of consumption in the United States based on surveys that it takes, but I have not seen any analysis that shows a correlation between the supply reduction effort and the interdiction effort. And we in GAO have not studied that in any detail.
Well, yeah, it's troubling that there's an absence of useful metrics to measure success of supply reduction programs, especially when we're spending billions of dollars a year. One of the principal goals of this subcommittee is to enhance and improve upon ONDCP's role in collecting and analyze data to ensure we create drug policy based on what works and knowing what doesn't work. One drug policy researcher has estimated that while the U.S. spends 60% of our budget on supply reduction, supply-side agencies spend only about 5 to 10% of the total drug policy research budget. Based on GAO's work, do you agree with this assessment that enforcement agencies are not adequately oriented towards data collection, research, and analysis that would conceivably improve programming?
We certainly think that that research and collecting good data on these problems is certainly needed. I mean, one of our major findings, as I mentioned earlier, from most of our work is that we don't have good performance metrics and we don't have good data that supports them to enable one to make good decisions about what course of action we should be taking. So that is a fundamental problem that we've seen throughout the 10 years we've been studying this.
Just a follow-up before Mr. Jordan asks questions. What types of assessment and program planning tools are needed by U.S. agencies to effectively assess counter-narcotics efforts? And are you aware of any of these agencies currently working to improve their metrics?
Okay, well, first of all, on the Department of Defense, the report that we're issuing today, we comment on the performance measurement system that DoD has in place. We're critical of that system. DoD is currently in the process of revising their performance measurement system. They've been working on that for several months. Our big concern really having to do with DoD is that we don't believe they can currently tell anyone exactly to what extent they're able to carry out their mission in terms of what works and what doesn't work, because they don't have a good way of assessing the performance of their program elements. Moreover, our report also shows we talked to many of their client organizations, and we found that many of them aren't using the performance system that's in place now. So they need to do two things. They need to first improve the system, and number two is they got to get their the commands that are carrying out the programs to use it as a tool for making the right kind of decisions. Those are the two things that we recommended in that report.
Thank you. Mr. Jordan, why don't you take seven minutes if you want.
That's fine. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me just pick up, Mr. Ford, where the chairman was. Of the $1.5 billion DoD spent last year, how much of that money was marked for assessment and measuring the effectiveness or lack of effectiveness of the program? Do you know that?
I do not know that. I do not know how much money they spent for performance measurement.
Okay. Okay. Well, I mean, that would certainly be a place to start when we're trying to figure out how to measure this. If we can't even tell how much money they allocated for that, that's an indication that it's not working the way we want it to. In your comments, Mr. Ford, let's go to Plan Columbia. I believe you said on Plan Columbia that it had met some of its goals, but not relative to coca crops. How far off were those? How far off were they from meeting their goals there?
Okay, well, I need to kind of explain. We issued a report in 2008.
Mm-hmm.
The original goal of Plan Columbia was to reduce, one of the original goals, excuse me, was to reduce coca cultivation by 50% using 2000 as a baseline. Our report in 2008, in 6 years, showed that after 6 years we did not achieve that goal. We did achieve that goal for poppy eradication, which was in our report. Since that time, we've seen some new data that ONDCP has put out that shows that the level of potential coca production has declined fairly significantly in 2008. So if you, over an 8-year period, you could argue they met the goal, but during the original goal, they didn't achieve it. And that's what our report said in 2008.
And is the failure to meet this goal, is this back to, I think, with the chairman's questioning, what do you attribute that to? Is it the lack of cooperation from local authorities, or elaborate if you would?
Okay, well, I think it's a little bit difficult to answer that question because part of this has to do with the way we survey what the potential is in that country. And when we started the program in 2000, the methodology that was used to determine what the potential coca cultivation level was and what the potential production was different. It changed in 2004 and 5. The CIA, who does these surveys, changed their methodology. So that came up with different results. So part of the problem was what denominator you use to try to judge that success level. Mm-hmm. So some part of it is what I would call a methodological challenge on a part of our government to determine what exactly exists there, what can be produced, and what the potential is for these drugs to come to the United States. So part of it is that. Then as far as the actual implementation of the program, you have to look at it over time. I think our work in the early years of Plan Columbia, we identified lots of problems with the way our government was implementing the program in partnership with the Colombian government. Over time, I would say that relationship improved fairly significantly, and that probably had a positive impact in the ability for us to eradicate some of those crops. But I don't think necessarily you can establish a causal relationship between all of those various efforts and the current outcome. I think we need to look at what the trend will be over the next several years to see if it really did have a meaningful impact.
Let's go back to this measurement and assessment concern, kind of in a broad category here. Why has the State Department not reported outcome-related information for over half of its major drug countries?
Okay, that work is based on a report we did on the transit areas. This is primarily in Central America,
right,
in the Caribbean. And in that work we identified, the State Department had identified a number of performance indicators, but they just hadn't matched them together with reasonable results. So you couldn't tell, they had an indicator that said we're going to train 50 police officers in Guatemala. But what they didn't say was whether or not that was, those officers in turn would be used to address the counter-narcotics problem versus just fighting crime in general. Those kind of things weren't identified in their reports. And so for us it was difficult to show what are the real results of this effort. We see that a lot, by the way. Often the administration will have these indicators like we trained a certain number of people. We added 5 pieces of new inspection equipment on the border, but we don't relink that to what are the outcomes of that. I mean, what are we getting for it? Are we seizing more drugs? Are we reducing the crime levels? Is the level of violence going down? Those kind of things we haven't typically seen in many of these systems we use to measure our programs.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman. I'm going to go to one more round of questions of Mr. Ford. New York Times is reporting that GAO's Merida Initiative report being released this afternoon found that the State Department has failed to set specific targets to determine whether the money was having the desired effect of disrupting organized crime groups and reforming law enforcement agencies. Is this an accurate summary of your findings with respect to Mexico?
I can tell you that the report hasn't been released yet, so I'm not quite sure where the New York Times got that information. But I can tell you that we are going to be reporting that performance measurement is a challenge. Absolutely.
Let's talk about Afghanistan. In March 2010, the GAO report evaluating the U.S. strategy to combat drugs in Afghanistan, one of the key points was that insufficient mechanisms were in place to evaluate the counter-narcotics strategy's justice reform pillar. To what extent is this deficiency specifically for Afghanistan or of U.S. counter-narcotics policy broadly? And is this also true in Mexico?
Yeah, I can tell you that our work looking at judicial reform, which is usually an element of our counter-narcotics or security strategy in many of these countries, that our work over the years has shown that the administration has not done a very good job of measuring the impact. Again, this gets into a case of we trained X number of prosecutors, that type of thing, which gives you some information but doesn't really tell you whether or not real reform in the country is occurring or not. The other thing, our work in Colombia, our work in Afghanistan shows that changing the judicial system in these countries takes years. We're attempting, in the case of Colombia, we attempted to have them change their prosecuting system to an accusatorial system similar to what we have in our country. That's taken years for them to put that in place. They have, my understanding is, they do have it in place now, but it was a long-term effort. We're trying to do that in Mexico. It's at the early stages, so I don't think we have any information to indicate whether it's having any impact. But the bottom line is those kind of programs are one of the key areas where we don't see very good performance information to tell you what the results are.
One final question. Your testimony states that counter-narcotics related programs often advance broad foreign policy objectives. And you cited Afghanistan as an example where the United States has combined counter-narcotics efforts with military operations to combat insurgents as well as drug traffickers. But isn't there also evidence that prior to the administration's decision to stop forced crop eradication, the counter-narcotics programs actually hindered rather than advanced foreign policy goals of stabilizing the country? Are there other examples where counter-narcotics have actually undermined other foreign policy goals?
Okay, well, with regard to Afghanistan, obviously the administration's changed its strategy there. And one of the rationales they've used is the one that you just articulated, that they felt that the eradication program was a negative influence on our counterinsurgency effort there. Now that the new strategy is to focus more on interdiction.
What do you think?
In terms of whether or not that's going to work or not?
Right.
I don't think there's any basis for us to say whether it will work or not at this point, because they just changed the strategy within the last year.
Based on your evaluation, though, of these programs in the past, do you have any informed opinion that you'd like to share with the subcommittee?
Well, I don't have an independent opinion of whether that policy was working or not. We said in the report their eradication goals were never achieved from 2005 to 2009. So for that 4-year period, the data would suggest we weren't achieving those goals. Whether we didn't say it was contrary, that policy was contrary to our counterinsurgency goals. We didn't make an evaluation of whether that was a wrong policy to implement that program.
Thank you, Mr. Ford. Mr. Jordan.
Yeah, just one question, and this may be more appropriate for Mr. Kerlikowske in the next panel. But is there an effort across government agencies to put in place, and the chairman was getting in this in his first round as well, a consistent way to measure how we're doing, to measure success or lack of?
I'll tell you what I know. It's my understanding that ONDCP is currently actually assessing the whole dynamic of how to measure performance. I don't know much about the details of what they're doing. I've talked to some of their staff, and they've indicated they're revisiting this whole concept, but I just don't know what they're going to be doing on it.
Have you looked at, has GAO done anything, and I probably should know this, but on the other side, the success of treatment programs, have you, and measurements we have there, have you looked at some of that as well?
To my knowledge, GAO has not looked at that extensively recently. The part of GAO that would normally do that work, my understanding is the last time they looked at this issue was at least 10 years ago. So
Really?
I'm not aware we've done any major significant work on treatment. However,
Do you happen to know
however,
how
I will
much- do
go
you happen to
back, for the record, I'll go back and check just to make
Okay,
sure that
do you
I'm
happen
right
to know-
on this.
Do you happen to know how much money we've, taxpayers have put into treatment programs?
I don't have that number in front of me. I know that is in the ONDCP budget announcement, but I don't have the exact amount in front of me, so I can't estimate what number that is.
Yeah, but certainly something we should be measuring and find out how we're doing.
I would
Is that
agree
a
with
yes?
that. I would agree with that. I think all aspects of our drug program should be evaluated. I agree with that.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Ford, the subcommittee will have some follow-up questions to present to you in the next few days.
Okay.
But we appreciate your presence there and your service to our country.
Thank you, sir.
You're dismissed as a witness, and we're going to call the next panel. I will introduce the next panel as our staffer helps to prepare this table for their testimony. Mr. Gil Kurlikowski is the Director of National Drug Control Policy. Mr. Kurlikowski brings nearly 4 decades of law enforcement and drug policy experience to the position, most recently serving 9 years as the Chief of Police for the Seattle Police Department. He also served as Deputy Director for the U.S. Department of Justice Office of Community-Oriented Policing Services. Ambassador David Johnson has served as the Assistant Secretary for the Bureau of International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Affairs at the State Department since October of 2007. In addition to numerous other distinguished posts within the federal government, Mr. Johnson served as Afghan Coordinator for the United States from May 2003 to July, from May 2002 to July 2003. And finally, on this panel, William Wexler is the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Counter-Narcotics and Global Threats. In that capacity, he leads the Department's counter-narcotics and policies and operations around the world. Mr. Wexler has previously served as Special Advisor to the Secretary of the Treasury and on the staff of the National Security Council. I want to thank each of the witnesses for being here. Your service to our nation is duly noted and appreciated. It is the policy of our Committee on Government Oversight and Reform to swear in all witnesses before they testify. I'd ask that you raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear the testimony that you are about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Thank you very much. Let the record reflect that each of the witnesses answered in the affirmative. As with the gentleman on the first panel, we ask that each witness give an oral summary of your testimony. Keep in mind that your entire statement will be included in the record of the hearing, and we ask that you try to keep it to 5 minutes in duration. Director Kurlikowski, let's begin with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman Kucinich and Ranking Member Jordan, distinguished members of the committee that I look forward to answering all of their questions in just a few minutes. I'm happy to discuss ONDCP's National Drug Control Strategy, which, as the Chairman knows, was not available at our last hearing, but has since been released by President Obama from the Oval Office. It is a comprehensive drug strategy that includes prevention, treatment, domestic enforcement, and recognizes the importance of interdiction cooperation with partner nations to reduce the supply of illicit drugs. You've asked us to focus on the international supply reduction programs and interdiction, which together constitute, as you mentioned, about 40% of the annual drug control budget. And these programs benefit the United States as well as our foreign partners. And our efforts against drug trafficking organizations reduce the supply of drugs available on American streets, while our allies increase their own capacity to resist the crime, violence, and corrupting influence of drug production and trafficking. This partnership to promote the rule of law and strengthen democratic institutions while dismantling drug cartels not only reduces domestic drug availability, it helps to achieve broader national security objectives. The international narcotics programs present a toolkit of initiatives, and these tools include interdiction, eradication, extradition, economic development assistance, institutional capacity building, law enforcement, human rights, judicial training, and international demand reduction assistance. How these tools are used depends in particular on the drug challenge, the available resources, the current capabilities, and the political will found in respective host nations. And where we have a strong and sustained commitment from elected leaders, such as in Colombia, the United States support can significantly strengthen the nation's security, human rights, and economic environment while reducing drug production. The globalized illicit drug trade requires collaborative solutions. The traffickers do not respect any borders. Both Colombia and Mexico have benefited from the brave and decisive leaders who insist on bringing traffickers to justice and regaining full control of their countries. The United States must continue to provide direct assistance to these two nations, as well as forge other partnerships in the Western Hemisphere, the European Union, the Federation of Russia, and Afghanistan as they address their respective drug challenges. Multilateral collaboration is another fundamental part of our international efforts. I had the opportunity to lead the United States delegation this year to the United Nations Commission on Narcotics drug meeting in Vienna, where we presented our policies on drug driving, access to treatment, and achieved approval of United States resolutions on community-based prevention and prescription drugs. And throughout the year, the United States agencies work with these international organizations, such as the UN and OAS, to address drug trafficking, money laundering, precursor chemical division, and to promote institution building, law enforcement, and international demand reduction programs. These international efforts have resulted in some significant accomplishments, and in June, I joined UNODC Executive Director Antonio Costa and the Russian Director of their drug czar, Chairman Ivanov, for the release of the United Nations 2010 World Drug Report. And the report highlights the recent significant decline in cocaine consumption in the United States. The conclusions of this report correspond with the progress reported in multiple domestic data sets, such as declining cocaine prevalence found in the surveys of youth, adults, and arrestees, as well as law enforcement reporting on the drop in purity and the rising price per pure gram of cocaine on U.S. streets since 2006. It's difficult to prove direct cause and effect, and I believe it's noteworthy that multiple U.S. drug indicators reflect positive domestic changes concurrently with a 43% decline in cocaine production in Colombia between 2006 and 2008. And cocaine provides a good example of how our international efforts work. Nevertheless, we must continually adjust and fine-tune our mix of programs. In fact, we're doing a performance reporting system that Mr. Ford just referred to. We are displeased and unhappy with the performance metrics that are out there, and the President's drug control strategy has devoted an entire chapter to working on improving the domestic measures and also improving the quality of the measures internationally. I look forward to answering your questions. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Ambassador Johnson, you may proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Jordan, members of the subcommittee, I'm grateful for the opportunity today to testify about the State Department's foreign assistance programs that seek to diminish counter-narcotics production and trafficking abroad and combat the illicit networks with which they are linked. Drug trafficking organizations show time and again that they have neither decency nor respect for the law and certainly no respect for human life. Cartels and traffickers demonstrate every day their only motive is profit. and profit they do, often overwhelming or circumventing the capacity of government resources to shut them down and corrupting public officials who stand in their way. This undermines public security, weakens democratic principles and institutions, and if left unchecked, provides a fertile breeding ground for the instability that can threaten our own national security here at home. That's where we at the State Department come in. As the Assistant Secretary of State for International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Affairs, much of the work that the team I lead does involves foreign assistance programs that give our foreign partners the tools to isolate and disrupt drug trafficking organizations abroad. Our programs directly impact and improve foreign government capacity, building a platform for joint work between our foreign partners and American law enforcement agencies. Our primary focus is to improve the criminal justice sectors, police, prosecutors, courts, and corrections of foreign governments, so that they can confront threats directly on their own home turf before those threats can reach our own borders. In key drug source countries, States assistance has disrupted drug trafficking operations and organizations in Colombia, weaned farmers away from drug crops in Afghanistan, and educated and treated populations affected by drugs or drug violence throughout Latin America and the Caribbean. After more than 10 years of U.S. support for Colombia's quest to secure their country, they've begun to self-administer the counter-narcotics, eradication, and alternative development programs that we helped to introduce. In fact, Colombia's consolidation plan to nationalize our joint programs is well underway. Although one of the initial goals of Plan Colombia, reducing the actual area of coca cultivation by 50%, has not been met, current cocaine production potential is approximately 295 metric tons, a 58% decline from the 2001 high of 700 tons, a significant achievement. This decline reflects not only gains through eradication, but also a significantly enhanced interdiction capability, with more than 280 metric tons of cocaine and coca base seized in 2009 by Colombian authorities. Most of these drugs would have otherwise ended up on the hometown streets of America or our partners and allies. Our experiences in Colombia have also informed U.S.-supported initiatives in Mexico, Central America, and the Caribbean, where drug supply or transit threatens our own national security. We know and have factored this into our strategic planning that criminal justice sector capacity building for the host government is the only long-term effective program, that the process is long-term and difficult, that political will is essential, but that the results can be well worth the investment. Mr. Chairman, the title for your hearing today is very important. International counter-narcotics policies, do they reduce domestic consumption or advance other foreign policy goals? As a diplomat who has spent his life representing our nation's interest abroad, my experience has been that our national security objectives and our domestic security objectives are always directly linked. As Director Kurlikowski has noted, we, the United States government, and the American people are already taking some steps on the domestic front. States' efforts abroad to build partner capacity is one additional piece of the administration's larger U.S. drug control policy to reduce the demand for the use of illegal drugs. Thank you for the opportunity to illustrate the role of the Department's foreign assistance programs. I'll do my best to address any of your questions.
Thank you, Ambassador. Mr. Wexler.
Thank you very much, Chairman Kucinich, Ranking Member Jordan. I appreciate the opportunity to discuss the Department of Defense's counter-narcotics programs, and in particular the steps we have taken and are taking to improve our performance management system, which I know is a strong interest of the committee. It's a pleasure to appear before you alongside my colleagues. The international illicit drug trade is a multifaceted national security concern for the United States, weakening the rule of law and preventing governments from effectively addressing other transnational threats. The global and regional terrorists who threaten interests of the United States often finance their activities through narcotics trafficking. Through its combatant commands, the military departments and defense agencies, the Department of Defense provides unique capabilities and expertise in support, and that's critical, we are a supporting agency on this mission set, in support of federal, state, local, and foreign law enforcement agencies. Maintaining force readiness through demand reduction programs for the armed services is also a critical component of our counter-narcotics efforts. Roughly half of our just slightly over $1 billion budget for FY 2011 supports international efforts, and the other half supports domestic law enforcement, demand reduction, and intelligence and technology programs. These efforts, coordinated through strong leadership of Director Kurlikowski and his team, are integrated into the Obama administration's wider whole-of-government approach that has been discussed. The narcotics threat has changed dramatically since the 1980s, when trafficking of cocaine directly into Florida made Miami Vice the hit television series. While the counter narcotics mission was not a principal focus of the department, Congress recognized that the Department of Defense was uniquely suited to conduct aerial and maritime surveillance of illicit drug shipments bound for the United States. Department of Defense programs, primarily implemented by U.S. Southern Command and JIATF South, have made tremendous impact on the drug flow directly into Florida and the U.S. mainland since then. While the counter-narcotics mission was once slow to be embraced by some defense policymakers, today the department is widely recognized as a critical component of the national drug control strategy, and JIATF South is viewed as a model for interagency coordination and regional engagement. Drugs, of course, still come into Florida, but the scale and challenge of this part of the problem is a shadow of what we confronted in the 1980s. During the late 1990s, Department of Defense played a vital role in the development and implementation of Plan Columbia by providing equipment, information sharing, and capacity building to the Colombian Armed Forces. In Colombia, defense counter-narcotics programs as part of a whole-of-government integrated strategy led by the Department of State, including DEA and USAID, have helped the government of Colombia increase its presence throughout the country, reduce level of violence, disrupt drug production and trafficking, and dismantle drug trafficking organizations. Through these efforts, today Colombia is an exporter of security in the region. Many challenges, of course, remain in Colombia, beginning with the diminished but continuing unacceptable levels of cocaine production there. But by any reasonable measures, the situation in Colombia today is far, far better than that which we confronted in the 1990s. In Mexico, our programs are supporting Professor Calderon's continued campaign to confront rising violence fueled by drug trafficking and other organized crime. Our support to Mexico complements the Merida initiative led by the State Department and is closely coordinated with our interagency partners both at Post and in Washington. Today, we are also applying the appropriate lessons learned in Colombia and elsewhere to confront heroin production and trafficking in Afghanistan. While the Department of Defense has traditionally provided counter-narcotic support to law enforcement missions, in Afghanistan our law enforcement partners such as DEA are providing critical counter-narcotic support for our military objectives. This support is critical because the drug revenues support the Taliban insurgency and undermine the rule of law by fueling corruption. While Afghanistan presents unique and complex challenges, the interagency cooperation fostered in Colombia is paying dividends today in Afghanistan. The revised counter-narcotic strategy that has been referred to previously for Afghanistan emphasizes the whole-of-government approach to counter-narcotics mission that is incorporated into our overall counterinsurgency strategy. Soon after coming into this office last year, it became clear to me that the department needed to do a much better job as it had before in evaluating the effectiveness of our programs. While performance measurements were being collected and reported, they were inconsistent, too focused on inputs and outputs, not adequately aligned with the national drug control strategy, and were rarely used as a basis for budgetary and policy decisions. Many of these issues have been highlighted in the GAO report released today. Recognizing the need to improve these performance management system for the department's counter-narcotics efforts, in June 2009, which was 1 month after I arrived, I launched a comprehensive review of the system. Based on this preliminary assessment, we identified corrective actions, and in May, I issued new performance measurements procedures for all programs my office supports. We are now undergoing a very thorough process to further identify and execute those efforts. In 2011 and beyond, we'll incorporate theater-specific data for each combatant command to further enhance the program's usefulness to leadership and program managers in the field. I spent the last 8 years before returning to government service as a management consultant. This subject is one that I am quite passionate about, and I know that any successful performance management system must be useful to the implementers as well as those making decisions from a programmatic level, so that they can effectively input the data that we are going to need to make the cost-effectiveness decisions that we have to make. Mr. Chairman, this concludes my prepared testimony. Thank you again for the opportunity to discuss these issues with you. I look forward to addressing any questions that you might have.
Thank you very much. We're going to have at least 2 rounds of questions to the panel. I'd like to begin with Mr. Kurlikowski. We're looking at what is, without a doubt, a multi-billion-dollar enterprise in just about every country where drugs are produced. What kind of work do you do, and can you give this committee any insight into whether or not there are any banks in this country that end up being the repository of massive amounts of drug money, or banks that are through which drug money is being laundered, banks in the U.S.?
Mr. Chairman, I don't know which banks would be involved in money laundering. I do know certainly
Do you look to see if banks are involved?
I don't look at the banks. I know that FinCEN, OFAC, the Treasury Department does. I'm very familiar with the Attorney General Goddard's settlement with Western Union, and I'm very familiar with the Department of Homeland Security work that is being done to not only look for the threat when it comes to finances, but also to stop the bulk cash that goes south. So I know that there are a lot of federal law enforcement agencies that are looking at that, and certainly some state and locals.
Now, do either of the other witnesses have any experience or information relating to money being laundered through U.S. banks or drug money being deposited in U.S. banks?
Mr. Chairman, not in U.S. banks. I would use this opportunity, though, to underscore the steps that the Mexican government has taken in the last several weeks, strictly to limit the amount of cash that can be deposited there as a way to provide a method for helping to combat the leakage into their own system.
Mr. Wexler?
Yes, sure. I would greatly encourage you to ask the Treasury Department this, but as someone who used to work at the Treasury, we have come a long way since the 1990s, when U.S. banks and the Congress was one that discovered this. U.S. banks were actively abetting, in some cases, drug trafficking organizations.
Well, with all the things, funny business that's gone on in Wall Street, it seems like it's an appropriate time to ask that question. We will contact, I'm directing staff. We're going to talk to somebody in Treasury about following up on those questions. Thank you. I want to ask, I read your testimony, Ambassador Johnson. You said that to ensure a comprehensive and coordinated approach to the drug problem in Afghanistan, we're currently working with our interagency and international partners to target narcotics traffickers and drug lords, especially those with ties to the insurgency. Are you also looking at those with ties to the central government?
The Drug Enforcement Administration has its largest deployment anywhere abroad, and a very comprehensive system to look at all forms of trafficking from wherever it is originating, and is working with the Afghan authorities as well as authorities here to develop cases. Those specific cases are something that I'm sure that no one would address during their development stage, but I will assure you that the DEA is looking at this without regard to whom may be involved. Well, the concentration on the traffickers who might be involved with the insurgency is a step that's been taken in order to complement the counterinsurgency strategy of the military, and so the targeting, the focus is of necessity there. But in terms of case development, it's without regard to person.
But if the central government's involved in looking the other way or discouraging reduction in demand, it's quite possible that you ought to be looking at them as well. Isn't that true? Right. You mentioned insurgents. There's an inflection there. I just wanted to see if that inflection represented an omission, a correction, or there was a lack of inclusion there in talking about the central government, which has become famous for corruption. I just wondered what you're doing.
The work has been, I think, of necessity focused as much as possible on where the insurgents are getting their cash and how they're operating in areas where we are seeking to prosecute the war. But to underscore again, the efforts that are being undertaken in the law enforcement area are without regard to origin.
I'm going to ask a question, Mr. Wexler, and then I've got a whole series of questions to ask you about your testimony. Mr. Wexler, given your involvement here, do you ever see any evidence where U.S. resources, particularly those that are being used by contractors of the U.S. government are involved in either the production of or the shipment of narcotics. Have you ever looked at whether contractors who are said to be working for the U.S. Are actually involved in any drug activities that move the drugs out of the countries in which we're involved militarily?
Sir, I've not seen evidence of any contractors that are involved in the drug trafficking problems that we encounter in